so today we're going to be talking about terminology and tips from professional authors. Primarily these are tips, but the reason I say terminology is because a lot of these are things that you might hear an editor or professional author use that means a specific tip/technique. So it's more just learning the lingo for authors and editors, because a lot of times editors will also know the professional authors' terminology. Granted, sometimes they don't, because not all of them are also authors. However, most of them, at least at some point, thought about writing. That's generally how editors work. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called Hang a Lantern on It. This one may sound very peculiar because obviously it's not obvious from the beginning what the heck this means. I actually learned this one from Brandon Sanderson because he uses it a ton in his podcast. Hang a lantern on it is pretty much when you have something very odd or peculiar in your story, or an obvious plot hole that you just don't want to acknowledge right this second. You're like, I'm going to explain it in chapter 5, but you don't need to know that right now, or I don't feel like you need to know that, but it would bother the reader to read it that way. So with hanging a lantern on it, you then point out the weird thing or point out the plot hole as an obvious point of the story, and it actually makes it feel less weird for the reader because you're acknowledging that it's weird. For example, if you have one of your characters and their parents literally named them Shakespeare, that's going to be a little odd, right? Yes,
in
question?
the book I'm reading, the Good to Murder series, the main character's name is Pippa Fitzamobi.
See, there you go. And I'm guessing she probably uses somewhere in here the hang a lantern technique where she says, like, yeah, I'm going to acknowledge the fact that the name is weird, but just move right on past that because the story's better. And you do the same thing with the Shakespeare thing. Maybe you say, yes, I get that joke a lot, ha ha ha, whatever. And if you point that out, it actually helps readers to go, oh, okay, so they did this on purpose. Because otherwise it can seem tacky, like with that name. It can seem very tacky if you just said, yes, this is the name of the character. It might sound like it was written by a 5-year-old. But then when you're like, oh, okay, they're pointing out, yes, this is a weird, tacky name, but they're doing it on purpose because, I don't know, their parents were hippies or their parents were super into Shakespeare and think it's a regal name and it's awesome and everyone else is like, you weirdos. Then that's okay. As long as you acknowledge it and point it out. And like I said, this goes the same for plot holes. You can't get away with this all the time with plot holes. Like, you do have to explain it eventually. This is just to help satiate the reader in the meantime. Where if you have something going on in your magic system, and then it's like, this will never work if they have blue hair. I don't know why this is the example, but I use it a lot. They can't have magic if they have blue hair. And then they have blue hair and they have magic. And you're like, whoa, you just broke your own rule. You then can hang a lantern on it and say, no one knows why I have my powers despite having blue hair. That helps the reader feel like, okay, you at least know that you made a mistake.
You know that you're breaking your own
You're
laws.
doing this on purpose, not on accident. And so it makes it feel more real to the reader rather than feeling like you're just cheating.
Your parents had a wig on her the entire time.
Exactly.
Poof, wig. Yes.
Plot twist, her hair isn't biologically blue.
Yeah, they just dyed it.
They just dyed it forever, and every week they're like, when they wash their hair, wonder why the water's blue. Anyway, yeah. So with this, you just want to make sure this term basically just makes sure that your readers feel comfortable in your world, irregardless of whatever flaws it might have or things that are quirky and fun. That you as a writer are like, I absolutely have to have this tacky, weird name. That is totally fine. Go for it. Absolutely. Have the weirdest name in the universe. Just make sure you hang a lantern on it so your readers feel like you know what's happening instead of just doing something cheesy.
You've acknowledged what you've done.
You've acknowledged that it's weird. You've acknowledged what you've done. All right.
It also be called the Alcatraz tactic.
Yes, Alcatraz. Oh my gosh. That's why I said Brandon Sanderson uses it a lot in the podcast. Sometimes even at the end of a podcast, he'll say like, yeah, let's can of worms that, or put a pin in that, but then he'll also say, let's hang a lantern on the fact that we have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about writing creative nonfiction, or different things like that. They're like, we have no clue, but that's okay, moving on.
I now want to write something.
I gotta say, it's actually pretty good. Yeah, I have a whole lesson on it because it's a lot more fun to write than you think. Anywho, creative nonfiction. So creative nonfiction, and I kind of explained this in the other lesson, but that's okay because today is basically just terminology. Creative nonfiction is the term for basically journaling. So you're telling a story of your life or someone else's life, but you do it in a creative way. So instead of just saying, today I ate a sandwich, you could do something like, the sandwich tasted like spiders. That's more creative, right? I don't know, but it just was what came to mind.
I haven't read it, but I'm going to assume it's kind of like Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. Basically where this author writes down her own life from like when she was super young to the previous times before she published it. And at some point, like, this one girl has like leukemia or something, and it just gets like really deep.
No, yeah. So a lot of things like that can be the case too. I know that I read one recently that was published because I go to Utah Valley University. At Utah Valley University, they have their own anthologies that they do periodically, and they have creative nonfiction, fantasy, and poetry in that one. And we were supposed to read a couple creative nonfiction from that. And there was one girl who basically, she compared her life living with bipolar to the life of Julia Wolfe, who also has bipolar as an author. And so she was kind of struggling with this because she's like, Julia Wolfe is like the worst author ever. I don't like her. I hate her. And yet, here we are. You have bipolar. I have bipolar. I'm not comfortable with that. And I actually really liked that because haven't we all had certain authors that we had to read for English, but we did not like their stuff? And that's okay. Not every author is going to be liked, and not every author is going to be popular, but that's okay. For example, I don't like Jane Austen. I'm sorry. I don't. But yeah, so with creative nonfiction, it's just helping bring to life your story in a more rich, deep, meaningful way instead of just, like I said, I walked down the street. Less factual and more poetic, creative.
It's not, I walked down the street and felt uncomfortable. It was more like, I walked down the street and it felt like everyone was watching me, judging my every move.
Exactly. You write it like you would a fiction novel, but it's your life. Or someone else's, but someone else close to you generally. You don't generally write creative nonfiction about someone famous unless you're a biographer, I guess. But anyway... the next terminology that I'm going to talk about, these guys are probably very familiar with, but I feel it is a great one to talk about. Okay, because a lot of people don't know this term because it is technically a screenwriting term. However, this screenwriting term has started to be used as a writing term. You also may hear it as in late, out early, but it doesn't alliterate, so it makes me sad, so I'm using the screenwriting term, which is exit early. So with this screenwriting, you usually have X amount of time to do a movie, right? You have to do it in an hour and a half or 2 hours, depending on what genre it is, and then that is it. The end. Moving on. With the in late, exit early rule, it helped ensure that they kept pace and kept interest and were able to tell the full story without it ever having drag. That's part of the reason why a lot of people don't like as much, kind of like me, Jane Austen novels. Some people love them. Yeah, and great for them. But for me, I don't like them as much because of the fact that it doesn't follow this rule. You get to learn the lineage of the characters and their great-great-grandfather, and then at the end it continues to talk about them forever and ever and ever and just be done already. Whereas with modern novels, they tend to follow a more succinct pattern of coming into the scene late and exiting early. With coming into the scene late, what I mean is you're going to have to jump into the middle of things. So instead of saying 7 years ago in the realm of the dragons there was a king dragon and the king dragon died, you can just jump into the middle and say there's a war going on and I am fighting for my life because all the dragons are trying to kill us because they think we killed the king but we're pretty certain we didn't. You know, that's going to make it far more interesting than if you just tell them all the information like a big long fantasy version of a textbook. Exiting early, on the other hand, is kind of like, you know, the whole happily ever after thing? It's the opposite of that, where instead of saying perfectly wrapped up with a little bow, happily ever after, yeehaw, you say, okay, but technically we wrapped up, that so-and-so and so-and-so got married, and they, whatever, I don't know, rebelled against the evil king, and there's now a better kingdom. But it leaves some things undone. It leaves some things untied. Like, whatever happened to that evil wizard in the forest, we'll never know, kind of a thing. And the reason it's important is because the exit early strategy helps keep interest with scenes. If you have a chapter where you just keep going and going and going and going, that's not going to be as interesting as if you say, oh yeah, and by the way, I can't even wait to tell you what happened tomorrow. End of chapter. Then you're like, well, what happened tomorrow? How could this possibly get worse? It helps keep your interest, helps keep the pace going, and helps keep the pace quick. You're going to want to look at your scenes and your chapters to make sure they kind of follow this. They don't have to follow this exactly, especially with chapters, because generally with chapters you need some slower chapters and you need some faster chapters. However, even your slower chapters should follow this rule, because it's going to help make them more interesting to read, even if it is a slow chapter. Even if all the chapter is them going off and into the woods and they're sad because their boyfriend dumped them or something, that's going to be far more interesting if you exit the scene early when they hear a branch crack behind them, rather than like the branch cracked and, oh, it's you, dramatic hair flip away. Like, that's far less interesting.
Like every YN story ever.
Yes.
I tied up my messy blonde hair into a big bun and flicked my things away from my big blue orbs.
Yes. Oh, orbs. Okay, I'm
Not
sorry.
eyes, orbs.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, that's a whole other tangent, but orbs. Never call your eyes orbs. I'm sorry. It was created for the first 5 people who did it. Now it is a fan fiction trope. Please don't. It was good until it wasn't. It's kind of like the damsel in distress. The first person to do damsel in distress, totally dope. Everyone else, please stop.
Yeah.
So there's certain things, and you'll do that even with your own novels. I have actually created my own tropes and problems in my novels, where I'm like, I just keep having them, like, I don't know. When I was younger, for some reason, I decided that it was far more interesting if someone got kidnapped and had to be rescued, regardless of whether it was the damsel in distress or the hero.
It's almost like a story ending.
Yep, and so I'm like, guess what? This is just my trope now. Someone gets kidnapped every 2 chapters.
Yeah.
It was bad.
It's like Stranger Things. This
Right?
video I saw, it's like, he broke this tortilla and was like, it's the gateway to the upside down. And he like stuck his head into the tortilla and was like, hey, stop killing people. You're not going to have a series if you keep killing people.
That's fair. That's very fair.
Yeah, with me, for some reason, I always have a main character whose name is Travis. Not like neither side character, but like whenever I need a name, like Travis. No, not Travis again.
I have a side character. I have a side character. His name is Bucket. Just Bucket, and your first interaction with him is him tackling down the main character.
I love that. But yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, we have a similar problem. My cousins always just say David. That's the go-to name. It's David of House David, darn it.
I have a terrible, like as a DM, I have a terrible habit of being like, what race is this person? Elf.
Elf, yes, always elf.
What do you mean we're in, like, the orc, like, elf? I don't care, elf.
They're an elf now. I feel
But
that.
we're with the
Yes.
unicorns.
Absolutely.
There's no elves here. Elf.
We're with the
Yes.
elf-hating race. Elf.
Elf. Exactly. But yeah, I gotta say, it's tropes are interesting to play with for sure, and you're definitely gonna run into your own tropes. So don't really be afraid of creating your own tropes, because sometimes that can be a good thing, and sometimes people like actually laugh about it later, and they're like, "This is the series trope," and the author's like, "But you're right." So like, you can laugh about it later; it'll be fine. The only issue is when it becomes like super fan fiction tropey. That's when it causes problems. Orbs. Oh, don't. Orbs. No. Please don't.
No orbs.
To the audience at home, please don't. They're eyeballs. Their eyes. You can say irises if you really want to be clever, but let's go with
windows
irises.
to the soul.
Windows to the
Or
soul.
if you want to be
There's so many
interesting.
other ways.
Or if you want to be interesting and add a certain disease to your story, or conditions, you could do pneumococcal microscopic silicovolcanic monomarshal cystic phobia, pseudocytic hypothyroidism, etc., etc.
All right. Okay. The next one that we're going to talk about is show don't tell, which is one that has probably been repeated to you guys a dozen times, and if it hasn't, well, hello, first time, let's go over this. So, with show don't tell, this is something that is going to probably pop up a lot, especially with editors, because of the fact that oftentimes we don't notice when we're telling versus showing, including myself. I've had a couple editors be like, this is totally telling, and I'm like, I'm ashamed. So, and don't be, it's fine. With show don't tell, you might have a lot of editors just be like show don't tell, and if you don't know what that means, that's not going to help you any, right? So let's learn this principle so that way not only can you apply it to your writing, but then if someone tells you in the future, you know what it means. That's basically this whole lesson, which I don't need to repeat, but that's me. So with show don't tell, it is basically making sure that it doesn't sound like a textbook, kind of like you were saying earlier. You know, they pulled their blonde hair into a ponytail, they brushed their hair out of their orbs, and the reason that works is because it's supposed to be showing, but it's showing done badly. Because showing is when you apply action to something. For example, her red hair flew in the wind, and her eyes sparkled with mischief, or something like that. That is absolutely a great example of showing. However, the reason that it gets tropey is because you got to make sure that you're not doing repetitive things. Because the thing with the ponytail is that, and the brushing your hair out of your face, those are both things that have been used so much. And with the orbs thing, just in general, don't call your eyeballs orbs. I hope they're not orbs, because that sounds scary.
It
Anyway.
sounds like you're some kind of psychic.
Yep, it sounds like you have just pure black eyes and you're staring into the soul of the future. But anyway.
You're just staring into his soul.
But anywho, so with show don't tell, definitely demonstrate, and you can do this tactfully too. There is such a thing as tactful telling. This is a lot more of what Jane Austen likes to do. You can absolutely do it better than Jane Austen though, because Jane Austen is, well, she does it, but she was one of the first people to do it. So like, as a result, there are some rough things there. But it can be done really well. With tactful telling, you just want to make sure that you show just as much as you tell. So like, if you say her red hair blew in the wind, you can also say, she'd always wished she was blonde like Celia, or something like that. So as a result of that, it helps give us context for how she's feeling through telling, right? It helps us know that she's envious of her without saying she was envious of her. So it just helps give a richness to the writing that grants us more liberty as a reader. You want to make sure you're not spoon-feeding it into your readers. Now this comes back to kind of the laid out early rule. Instead of saying there once was a dragon king that died, you show that the dragon king died by the fact that there's a giant war going on and everyone's killing each other over this dragon king. That is showing the consequences rather than telling you what happened. One reads like a textbook, the other reads actually like poetic writing. And you don't always have to show either. But I would say show 90% of the time, tell 10% of the time, because telling isn't as compelling as showing unless you use it purposely as a highlight. If you're showing, and then you suddenly tell the reader something, they know that's important. Whereas if you just tell them the whole time, it's hard to differentiate what's important and what's not. I dropped my marker. So, it helps the reader differentiate what's important, what's not important. It also helps us to feel like we're more immersed in the story because it's easier to use the 5 senses when you're using show versus tell. When you're just saying, it smelled like fresh cut grass. That's not as enticing and as enthralling as saying like the aroma of fresh cut grass enveloped me as I lay down, or something like that. That feels more like the senses are honed and heightened instead of being just told this is what's happening So figure it out. All right, the next thing. This goes kind of along with show don't tell. However, it is a totally different thing. Yeah, I was gonna say most of you have probably heard of info dumping. If you haven't, this is why we have this lesson. With info dumping, this is again where you basically just give a textbook line of information. You just go and go and go and go and go. However, this can be done with showing versus telling, actually, which is kind of funny. So yes, it's generally telling that is the culprit for info dumping, but not always. You can absolutely, and I've even in my creative writing class right now, I have 2 people who I read their stories and they did beautiful. They showed the whole time, there was not one bit of telling, and yet it was absolutely info dumping. The reason why is because they, instead of like easing you into the story and kind of being like, you know, the blue grass crushed beneath my feet, you know, that's cool, you know, and easing into the story, they were just like, boom! The blue grass crushed beneath their feet as the dragon flew over the hair, and you're like, too much is going on, too much is going on. Information overload. You want to make sure that you ease them into it. If you're introducing a new world, take it slow. If you're introducing a new mythological creature, take it slow. I mean, it's totally okay to say, hey, you know, it's a unicorn or something like that. And if you have a unique version of unicorns, you can be like, its fur shone gold or whatever. You can add uniqueness, but make sure that you give them a little bit of the familiar. Because if they don't feel anything familiar, the reader feels like they're drowning. There's too much going on. There's too much immersing their world. And they need to feel like there's something to hold on to. So even if your world is completely unique race, completely unique characters, completely unique animals, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, what makes it feel familiar for Dungeons and Dragons and is a good principle in writing is we have bards. We all know what a bard is generally. We have paladins. We all know what a paladin is generally. We have wizards. We all know what a wizard is generally.
Notoriously weak.
And so as a result, we have all these terms that help us to stay grounded, or things that are easier to understand, like elves and orcs. These are all things that are previously based. So if you're building a new world, make sure that you are able to give them something to stay grounded in. For example, with Percy Jackson, summer camp is generally, even if you haven't gone to a summer camp, you know what a summer camp is. You know what it looks like, you know what it sounds like, kind of a thing. So he grounded us in something very familiar. Even if you've never been, you know what it is. A summer camp. However, he then threw you into the unusual, right? So as a result of that, he blended both to help give less info dumping. So because you had something familiar that you could use to stand on while you're getting all these waves of information washing over you, instead of just dumping you into the ocean. We don't like to drown our readers. It's generally mean. I mean, you can if you want to, but just know your readers will be sad. All right, now I'm going to go over a few terms that are a little more boring, but it's important for you to know as writers when someone asks you this or you ask someone else to do this. Line editing. Now there is actually a difference. When you say editing, the problem is everyone just assumes editing means editing. No, there are different types of editing, believe it or not. And this would actually be very helpful for me if you ever have something you need me to look over. For example, line editing. This is not just your basic grammar, it is also how the sentences sound. For example, if I was to read this book out loud, would it feel good in this way? Would it read fun? Would it just flow off the tongue? Or is it too wordy and it trips up? Or is it redundant in places? So it's not just grammar. It's a little bit of grammar, obviously, but it's not just grammar. And with this, I would say the best thing you can do to avoid having like heavy line editing problems is read your story loud. Because honestly, you might have a sentence that sounds super cool in your head, but the second you read it aloud, you're like, holy cow, I didn't stop to take a breath. This is 84 words long. Maybe I need to break it up.
84 word long sentences. I feel like I've done that before.
We all have at some point where we're just like, this sentence is too cool, it cannot end. And then you're like, no one can read that.
And then you realize, like, oh wait, this has like 5 different thoughts in it. I should have like 5 different sentences.
Exactly. I need to break it up a little bit, chunk it off. And sometimes it's even just finding your quirky little things too. For example, the word just, actually, suddenly. Those are 3 words that authors use all the time that they don't necessarily have to. Just, actually, and suddenly, great words. But I would say probably use them 1% of the time. Most authors use them more like 25% of the time. In which case you're like, okay, we don't need like half of those. And that's okay. You're all gonna have your own quirky fun words too. Those are just 3 examples of common ones. But for me, that is actually mine. I say that way too many times in every single sentence. I have to like control find and write that and then just go through my story and reevaluate every single that because I tend to do it too much. And that's okay. We all have our own little quirks and little problems with our writing, and that's okay because we all have our own unique voice, right? It's no different than me talking right now. I have a lot of hiccups and redundancies and problems. That's because that's me. I'm ADHD. But that's okay. It's also what makes my voice very unique. All right, moving right along to developmental editing. I'm just going to say dev editing, so that way it's easier for me to write. With developmental editing, this is when it comes to magic problems, if you're doing fantasy, science fiction problems, and logic-based problems, character inconsistencies, and plot holes. The big 5. I would say character inconsistencies, plot holes, and magic development are the main 3, though. The other 2 are just nice to have. With those 3, you generally always want a developmental editor. If you are publishing traditionally, you almost always are going to want to get a developmental editor before you try to do that. You don't have to. Some people do it without it, but why do you want to do that? It's because with developmental editing, the top 3 things that I talked about that they use in developmental editing, character inconsistencies, magic building if you're doing fantasy, and plot holes, those are your top 3 that people are going to throw you out for. That is why you get rejected. It is not because of for a lack of it's not for a lack of good writing. It's not even spelling errors. It's not even punctuation, people. This is what kills you. You could literally, I'm not kidding when I say this. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, he could not spell to save his life.
Me neither.
And yet he's a famous author. Why? Because they saw the potential in his writing because his development was good. Even if his line editing was atrocious. So just know, yes, generally having a good set and it reads well with line editing is good, but developmental editing is your biggest issue. Was that a comment / question?
There's a girl that I watch, and she was reading like the History of Babel or something. It's like this really big book, and she said that it's kind of wordy, but it like there's a lot of like set rules, but it's like kind of confusing in the beginning.
Yeah, and as a result of those kinds of things are what is going to throw a reader out of the book. As a result, it's what's going to make an editor or a publisher less likely to want to publish your stuff. Not saying you can't get past that, but it is harder. For instance, I actually was an intern at a publishing company called Monster Ivy for about a year. And during that time, I came across a manuscript that we all had to vote on what manuscripts we thought were the best. And I was down for this manuscript. I was like, dude, this is the best horror I've ever read, and I hate horror. I'm like, I want to read this, and I don't even like horror. I loved it, but the problem is, my companions were right. It was going to take a lot of editing because they had a lot of character inconsistencies, a lot of magic flaws, and in general, their whole plot had a lot of holes because it kind of revolved around this character going and doing this thing that she didn't really seem properly motivated to do. It seemed plot convenient, which unfortunately was really sad because I was totally like, yes, this is an epic story, but the problem was it just was missing a few of those basic things that could have been, that if they'd gotten a developmental editor, I can tell you right now, we would have taken that book. Absolutely, it would have gotten published by Monster Ivy. Yes?
What is a manuscript?
Manuscript! Ah, yes! See, this is why I'm having this day. Defining all the terms, because I think it's important. There are a lot of terms that I use and that people will use as you move forward, and it's going to be rough. Manuscript basically just means finished novel. So anything that is above, I would say, 25,000 words and is not a novella is considered a manuscript. Unless you're doing children's literature, in which case obviously the number goes down for word count, but generally if it's YA and above, 25,000 words or more is the minimum for it to be a completed manuscript. Although I would say 50,000 is more like YA, but as I said, novella is the bottom rung, which is generally 25,000. But yeah, it's with manuscripts, I would generally say developmental editing is going to be your biggest pitfall, which is part of the reason why I know and I want you guys to get published. Honestly, it's the best experience I've ever had. I've been published three times through short stories, and I'm working on my own novel, and I loved the experience. Sure, it was hard with the 7 times I've been rejected also, but at the same time, the success is well worth it. And having those developmental edits definitely increases your chances. It doesn't guarantee you, unfortunately. That's the one bad downside of developmental editing. However, it does increase your chances by far. Alright, any questions with that? Okay, you good? Perfect. And thank you for asking that, because I use a lot of terms that are editing terms that I forget it's a term rather than an actual, predefined word. Alright, next one. Alright, this is going to sound weird, but yes, this is a term. Alright, so,
Yeah.
yes. I was like, some of you have probably heard of this. Just in case, I like doing this because some people haven't heard of it. I honestly didn't hear about it until I was about 17. So, sometimes people hear about it later in life. Marty Stu came first, Mary Sue came after, but Mary Sue has become more predominant in today's feminist generation. I have no problem with empowering women, but there are still problems with Mary Sue. I am all for powerful women. I currently am writing a novel where the main character is a fantastic female who is also very into science at an age when you shouldn't have been a scientist for a female. So I'm all for empowered women, but this is a problem. So, Mary Sue / Marty Stu. Basically, irregardless of gender, you could even do this gender neutral if you wanted. Point is, they're overpowered. They are the person who gets it perfectly after everything. They try once and they fail, and then they're like, I will never make it. And then someone tells them to believe in themselves, and they're like, I will, and it works perfectly.
That character flaw is having freckles.
Yep, exactly. It's like, okay, so many things wrong with that.
Superman.
Yes, Superman was absolutely one of the very first Marty Stu characters. The reason he works is because he was a superhero in an age when superheroes were very, 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 very new. That is the only reason it worked. No longer gonna work. I'm sorry, that's not gonna fly anymore. But so if you want to try to do a Marty Stu or a Mary Sue character, I would say
Good luck.
good luck. Seriously, good luck. Because it's not relatable. The main issue with Mary Sue and Marty Stu is it's not relatable. We want to feel like they are part of us. And even if they're a fantasy character, you can't just say, oh, they're an elf, therefore they're perfect. No. They have to have flaws. I'm sorry. I was just it was a perfect cop-out. But anyway, you can't just say that they are perfect because of that. That can't be the only thing. They have to still fail sometimes. And even if it's in small ways, or they see themselves as a failure, or, like Sherlock, for instance. Sherlock is an absolutely brilliant detective, right? He is perfect at it. He is absolutely a Marty Stu, but what makes him not a Marty Stu is that he can barely get out of bed in the morning sometimes because he's a drug addict. And so it's like, yeah, when he actually does detective work, he's great, but sometimes he can't even get out of bed. So as a result of that, it made him relatable. It made it so people were like, dude, I feel that. Sometimes I don't want to get out of bed, and I'm not even on drugs. Sometimes you just don't want to get out of bed. So it makes it feel more real. It makes it feel more relatable. Oftentimes with Mary Sue, part of the problem too is that becomes their personality, right? Them being powerful becomes their personality. And I hate to say it because I know I have a lot of friends who love Captain Marvel, but this is absolutely Captain Marvel's one big flaw. Is the fact that she had the potential to have a great story, but the problem is that she was absolutely a Mary Sue character. Her only personality trait was, I'm powerful.
Yeah.
that was it.
It's really just, I'm this small town girl, and whoa, I've got powers now.
Exactly.
I'm so cool.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. Okay, and the 5-minute training montage, also not okay.
That actually happened in 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I've actually seen this in a couple manuscripts that I've edited in the last little bit, where they're like, literally, they're like, okay, we're gonna spend the next 5 minutes in class, and everyone else is like struggling, and the main character is like, "Wah!" And it's like, no, you don't immediately understand your superpowers. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
I swear, I read a book one time, or I had like some sort of dream or whatever, where it was like this main character was this black-haired, like 7-foot tall dude, and it was like this superhero thing, and he hadn't unlocked his power yet.
Obviously.
And they were doing like this: do you have super strength? Do you have super speed?
Yes.
Do you have this ability, etc. And they were having them like bench press trucks, like semi trucks, and he was the only one that could do it. And he's like, why is this so easy? And he did like 1,000 in like 2 minutes, and I'm like, why?
Yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem. And it's because it just makes them not relatable. All of us fail at something, right? Even if it's not everything. Some of us fail at everything, but not everyone fails at everything. For example, I am really not that great at math. Can I do it in a pinch if I need to budget? Yes. That is it. Any other time you ask me to do math, I will say, nope, I'm pulling out my calculator. I refuse. However, I've been told numerous times that I'm really good at English. I will pump out an essay the night before because I totally spaced it, and it will get a B+ at worst. So I know I'm talented at English. However, I completely abysmally fail when it comes to math.
Yeah, they're like, I'm great at math.
You gotta balance it out. Okay, and you can't pull the kryptonite thing. It can't just be one thing that for some reason shouldn't exist and yet does. I'm sorry.
It's like, if you're from another planet, you should have something that you're weak to that's from another planet.
Right,
Yeah, no,
or
this is-
even
this
in
is-
general, like...
Superman's more like the fact that he doesn't have any personal flaws. I feel
No,
like it's more
not
than
really.
the physical flaws it is.
Yeah, so he doesn't have any physical flaws, but he also doesn't have any personal ones either. He's the epitome of perfection. And it is funny because everyone constantly is like, what if Superman goes evil? We have to hoard all the kryptonite, right? That is a joke. Why is it a joke? Because everyone's like, dude, why hasn't this guy gone evil? There is nothing that phases him. Girlfriend dies. I'm fine. Main, father figure dies. I'm fine. Mother figure dies. I'm also fine.
His
no
dog
one
dies.
would be fine after all that.
It's terrible, compared to Superman to Batman.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
Batman's own personal, sad boy, depression.
Right, and that's what makes Batman so much, in my opinion, better than Superman,
Yeah,
because
But
he's
the
relatable.
thing is, though, that they're also incredibly different to the point where they can. One of them can be relatable in a bit, but others
Absolutely.
not at all. Because
Yeah.
Clark Kent is like a freaking billionaire, and he's like, oh, let me put on some glasses and not have my underwear outside of my suit, and now I'm like super cool.
What a mood. Oh man, I feel that though. It's so funny because they both take very different approaches to things, and on top of that, it's just it's hilarious because I think that was one of the best parts about when they actually did series for Superman and stuff like that. Like for Supergirl in particular, they had 4 or 5 times where her boss is like, "I am certain you are Supergirl. You just need to take off those glasses," and I am certain.
It's like
because it's like, really, glasses? Come on, that's all it took.
Daily Bugle, and they're like, why are you producing such good Spider-Man photos?
Exactly.
Like, how do you get these photos so up close? The best photo that they've ever gotten of them
Literally
is this.
just selfie.
Yeah, literally a selfie.
These are literally selfies. I know you're Spider-Man. Get out.
Right. Oh man, it's kind of like in the Batman movies. No, Batman lives in Bruce Wayne's basement, and it's like, no, he's Batman. So yeah, there can be some hiccups and faults there. The superhero, okay, the thing with superheroes is they can get really tropey, and they can be done well, but there can also be a lot of problems. Oh, and I don't know if you guys have seen the trope versus cliche video, or if not, then feel free to watch it. But with tropes versus cliches, in general, tropes can be done well and cliches can be done well. The problem is that you have to take your own unique spin on it. instead of just doing damsel in distress, you can do damsel in distress, but then she tries to save herself and the prince ends up getting captured or something like that. You know, you gotta put something unique to it. You can't just do, X equals Y formula.
Yeah,
it is the perfect example of taking
yes.
tropes and cliches and spinning them.
Yes, absolutely, and that's why people loved it so much, is because it took every trope and cliche. It was just like, nope, table flip.
Or even, I don't know if any of you guys have seen the short film Wolfwalkers, but that's a really like unique spin on the like werewolf idea.
Cool.
And
I'll have to look into that.
Like, I completely lost my train of thought. It's not, this prince is going to save this lady,
right,
and it works out perfectly. It should be like this princess has been longing to leave, so she ends up actually trying.
Yep.
And she gets like fatally injured, and by some miracle or no miracle at all, she gets found or not found, and she just dies in the first scene, or she doesn't die in the first scene.
And like
awesome. Speaking of which, the next terminology, which seems pretty obvious, but I've had some people asking questions about this before, is try and fail cycles. With this, it is basically the rise and fall that helps develop and avoid Mary Sue / Marty Stu. It makes sure that you see their failures just as much as you see their trying. And personally, I think that the bigger the reward, the harder you have to fail. If your character is just like, oh, I kind of suck at this, and then they're suddenly like, boom, good, that's what creates the Marty Stu and Mary Sue.
They're just like really bad at it at first. And then when it comes like they're fighting like the enemy, it's like, oh yeah, I can do this perfectly now.
Right? It's just, no, please don't. And even, you can have different flaws too, with, for example, with Harry Potter, right? Harry isn't exactly the best in magic. He's just not. And neither is Ron. However, Hermione, even though she's fantastic at magic, A, she studied her butt off. B, you know that with Hermione, she may be great at magic, but she struggles when it comes to social situations. And that's relatable, right? That helps make her relatable, because you see how much, even if she's so good at magic, she is failing in other areas. Like I kind of said with Sherlock. He's not failing at the case per se, but he is kind of failing at life. And this helps make the character feel more rich, feel more deep, and feel more well-rounded with these try-fail cycles. And with that, like I said, don't do the 5-minute training montage where it's just, oh yeah, I've never used these superpowers before and now all of a sudden I'm great at it.
It's like,
No. You have to have at least a week, possibly a month. That is my opinion, if you're learning superpowers.
A lot of things like that, where they take a lot of potential and exercise to do, they can take years to develop or
to
master.
properly hone and master, right? I can understand if you do like, okay, they try a little bit and they're better at it, but not like they're perfect at it. There's a difference. All right.
I try a little bit and then I'm like,
Next thing, and this is actually, okay, this may seem wild to you, but I've actually run into 3 manuscripts recently that use the improper terms here. So we're going to go over it.
Oh no.
The cutscene versus prologue. Yes, they are different things. It's not prologue. And then, of course,
prologue in my brain with that monologue.
monologues are also fantastic. Anyway. Okay, so, and then in parentheses, epilogue, because we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So, a cutscene is when you take a scene from the middle of the story, end of the story, anywhere else in the story aside from the exact beginning, and put it at the beginning, and then you re-reference it later. So, for example, that's technically like Megamind. Emperor's New Groove.
Yeah,
Yes, with the llama. Or Megamind, where he's falling through space and he's like, I bet you're wondering how this happened. I was like, yeah, exactly. That is a cutscene.
or Albatross.
Cutscene. Sorry.
Oh my gosh, Albatross.
Yes, or Albatross.
Where I was.
Oh my gosh. Albatross. Anyway, so,
Oh
but
my
this,
freaking gosh, Albatross.
let me emphasize though, that is a cutscene. Why? Because it is cutting back and forth in time. It is not a prologue. So if you're going to call something a prologue is chronologically came before the book chronologically. Not just came before, but came before chronologically as well. And then you go into the future and talk about things. This is literally the opposite of what a cutscene is. But that's okay. People tend to get mixed up. I think they just assume if it comes before the book, it's a prologue. But that's okay. That's why we're talking about
I'm
it.
gonna say, 'cause there's, in the Shadow-Me novellas, you have, you have the second book, and you have the first novella, and then you have the third book. And the third book, it's like, oh, everyone's getting these magical powers, and blah, 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 and they're learning how to harness them, and oh no, there's this breakup. And then in the novella, at the end of it, you see these two characters together who actually end up, later in the series, being married, and...
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I kind of dropped the series.
It
got weird by book 4.
That's fair. Some series do. But yeah, so with that, cutscene is when it's a jump forward and then you jump back. Prologue is when it's chronologically. So let's just do the example. 1, 2, 3.
Timeline-wise.
Yeah, timeline-wise. Here's where the prologue comes in. Cutscene is you'd go.
2, 1, 3.
Yeah, you go 2, 1, 3. You
1,
skip
2,
to the
3.
middle, and then you come back and revisit it briefly in the middle here. That is what a cutscene is versus a prologue. And then of course we have epilogue. This is basically anything you want to tell out of the story that is after the ending. So it's not during the ending, it's post-ending. So a lot of you guys probably are familiar with the Harry Potter whole train scene with his kid. Yeah, absolutely epilogue. That is not part of the ending. That is just part of cute, don't you want to see what Harry Potter's family looks like? That is... So with those terms, I just felt it was necessary to do that purely because I've been seeing that a lot, and I think a lot of people don't know what the word prologue means. Which is funny, because you'd think you'd read enough prologues to figure out what prologue means, but that's fine. This is why we're defining these terms, is because clearly they are confusing. Alright, moving right along. My last and personal favorite, which is why I left so much time for it, Chekhov's gun.
Red herring also kind of fits as a subcategory almost.
Subcategory. Yeah, I would say subcategory for sure. Let's talk about that red herrings as well. Alright, so Chekhov's gun is foreshadowing. So for example, with Chekhov's gun, the whole reason he talked about this is because he was a screenwriter. Once again, screenwriters, yay! I love screenwriting. Most authors actually were originally screenwriters. The author of Hunger Games got her degree in screenwriting before she decided to become an author. So it's actually very, very useful. If you wanted to get a degree in screenwriting instead of creative writing, you could absolutely do that, and you would learn a lot. So I would say you have options. But with Chekhov's gun, he actually has a quote. I'm not going to quote it exactly, so paraphrasing. He mentions the fact that when doing the 3-act structure, you need to make sure that whatever appears in Act 1 is used by Act 2, and that it is all resolved by Act 3. So for example, if there is a gun on the mantle, I can't draw guns, so I'm just going to do pew. If there's a gun sitting on the mantelpiece in the beginning of the scene, you're then going to use that gun in the climax to defeat whatever intruder comes into the house.
Exactly. Like in the Shadow-Me series, again, spoiler, if you want to actually read it.
Quickly skip ahead 10 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. The main character, she can't touch anyone because of a paralyzing kill.
Oh,
But in the climax of the first book, when these two people are escaping along with the main character, with the main character and her boyfriend,
boyfriend,
when they break up in the second book, that can't be together or whatever, the main bad guy ends up touching her, and he doesn't get hurt at all. So her power ends up being useless to a couple of the boys, and there's this love triangle. There's Kenji, who's hey pretty, or whatever, and he's like, don't you love me? But he doesn't like her at all. He's just messing around. Meanwhile, Warner and Adam are like, love me.
Anywho.
Mainly Adam.
No, yeah, absolutely. If you have characters, so it can be, I say Chekhov's gun, but it's just in general Chekhov's fill in the blank. It could be Chekhov's person, it can be Chekhov's gun, it can be Chekhov's pearl necklace, it can be Chekhov's,
little sister that totally doesn't die later.
Yes.
Because, insert character had to sacrifice her life.
It's Chekhov's little sister, and so on and so forth. It's basically foreshadowing done well. And I feel that, honestly, one of the series I feel does this the best with Chekhov's gun is Gravity Falls.
Oh, yes.
Because they take every single episode and at least one thing in the episode matters in the final, right? Even if it's just a weird road sign, it matters. And they acknowledge that, and it helps make the ending feel even more rich, because it feels like all these random episodes that didn't seem to align together, they come together in such a beautiful way that you feel extra rewarded. Wow, that was a hard word for some reason. So with Chekhov's gun, it can be incredibly rewarding for your reader to see something and then say, I bet they'll use that later. And then if you don't, they're sad. For example, if you say, oh yes, and there's this hot guy in the corner, and she's totally staring at him, and then you never do anything else with the hot guy, your readers are going to be totally disappointed. They're like, I shipped them for a hot second, and then you just totally abandoned that plot line.
Yeah, until like 12 books later, and it's like, hey, he's back, don't you remember him? And I'm like, no, who was that? Well, go read the first book. He showed up in 0.2% of the book.
Yep, he showed up for one page. It's like,
Not even one page, he showed up for like a sentence.
It's like, no, you gotta actually use this.
Maybe a paragraph.
Maybe.
So,
If he's lucky.
moving
Yeah,
right
exactly.
along to red herrings. This is a great, what's the word, mirror to this, so to speak. This is when you purposely throw something out to confuse the reader. So this, I would say this is not Chekhov's gun done badly, this is Chekhov's gun done well but different. So basically what you do is you make them think it's this, but then when you go back, it's obvious it's the other. So this is what mysteries do a lot of the time, right? Where they'll have a character get killed off or something, and so you're like, oh, it obviously can't be them, and then it's like, psych, they faked their own death, so actually it was them who was the murderer.
There was a Clue with the, like, there was a movie called Clue. Right?
Yeah, Clue, the movie. But anyway, the whole idea is like the fact that with red herrings, it helps throw you off the trail, but then when you look back at it, you're like, oh yeah, duh, it's obvious that it's so-and-so. It just all lines up perfectly. For example, I was watching a TV series recently, and I actually really liked what they did with it, because they did the werewolf thing, since we're talking about werewolves earlier. And the whole idea is that werewolves were a race of people who like normally were very peaceful, just kind of had this canine aspect, but they went crazy during the full moon. And they thought they'd all gotten extinct. So they were like, this is kind of weird that we're seeing more like attacks like this. And they have this guy who crashed his car, and he happened to be running in the direction of these hikers, and he was injured and has all this blood all over his clothes, and the blood matches that of the 2 dead hikers that were attacked. And so you're like, it's absolutely 100% him, right? But then you go back, and it turns out as he was driving, if you'd watched the whole episode, as he was driving, he was talking to his mom and saying, hey, I'm coming over for dinner tonight. You sure you're going to be okay? It's his mom who's the psycho killer. And if you, so it's one of those ones where it's totally a red herring that it's him because he has the blood all over his clothes, but it's because he tried to stop his mom from attacking these people. Right? So good. But anyway, I love good writing. But I honestly, with red herrings, it's not Chekhov's gun done badly, it's Chekhov's gun done well. You do Chekhov's gun, but then you throw an alternate Chekhov's gun out there that isn't loaded, and the loaded one is over there. There you go.
Chekhov's dart gun.
Chekhov's dart gun, exactly. So you have a loaded dart gun in the corner and the unloaded gun over there, so you clearly want to use the gun on dart. So yes, it helps give a little bit more to the writing when you use red herrings. Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that one. All right. Any questions before we finish this one for the lesson? Questions or other terms that you've heard and know nothing about or are confused on?
Oh, yeah, no, I like 30,000, but those are made up words. That one's really made up.
Fair enough. Made up words generally are confusing.
Yeah. One of them was,
Looks like you have a question,
I would
maybe.
say like any tips for like how to write plots or like fantasy things on your own, like how
Plotting in general?
yeah,
Or
like kind
yeah.
of like that, yeah.
I would say absolutely look up the 7-point plot structure. It's my favorite. The reason why is because it gives you a like a heavy structure without being too heavy-handed. It makes it so that you can go from plot point A to plot point B, and you know exactly where you're going, but it still gives you enough leeway to get lost in the middle, kind of. So you can feel like you're naturally kind of writing and finding your flow, but at the same time you know where you're going. It's kind of like trail markers on a hike. So I would absolutely say look up the 7-point plot structure. It'll probably say by Dan Wells. Funnily enough, Dan Wells literally said in his lesson that it was from a Star Trek role-playing guide. No one believes him though. I think they will still think it's his. But it is called the 7-point plot structure, and it is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it if you're struggling to plot your book at all. Especially because the 3-act structure tends to be a little too loose, I find, and then other plotting methods are way too strict. But 7-point generally is good middle ground. So I'd say try it. If it doesn't work for you, that's also okay. Everyone has different methods. I know that unfortunately I didn't record it because it was back when I wasn't recording, but I did do a lesson on all different types of plotting. If you would like me to redo that lesson, I can absolutely do that. Yeah, because there's like 8 different types. So, alright, I'm going to end this video real quick, and I will see you guys on the video later.